This House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here.
Hell hath no fury like the Speaker scorned. The government has spilled out detail after detail about the budget and the 3-year spending review. With the help of politicians and a senior economist, we'll be interrogating where it's likely to position the government and what it means for the pound in your pocket. And despite the government's promise to deal with the building safety crisis, Newsnight has learned that documents crucial for remedial work to go ahead regularly appear to be nowhere to be found. And from Lebanon, how people are trying to cope in the midst of financial devastation.
No health, no food, no gas, no electricity, no hope.
Good evening. Budget Day is one of the few big set pieces of Parliament shrouded in secrecy, the subject of sometimes wild speculation, cabinet ministers bound to vows of silence, everyone waiting for the inscrutable Chancellor tantalisingly waving his, for it has always been his, red box. Well, not this time. It is Rishi Sunak's big day, arriving in post as he did in the pandemic and immediately with no option but to throw money at the crisis. So this is his first real reckoning. The spending review signals the direction of the government for not 1 but 3 years. But thanks to the government itself, we already know a slew of policy plans to be announced tomorrow, from the increase in the minimum wage to £9.50, along with spending commitments amounting to more than £20 billion. And we know that underpinning tomorrow's announcements will be the pursuit of the government's levelling up agenda. But how's it all to be paid for? What exactly will be the fiscal rules? Will prudence be mentioned? There's to be no return to austerity, according to Boris Johnson. But will there be austerity by another name in some departments which are not health or, to a certain extent, education? And will there be any tax bombshells or even squibs? Here's our economics editor, Ben Chu.
The Chancellor's very big day arrives tomorrow, a budget and a 3-year spending review. But what should he be worrying about more? Inflation or growth deflation? The Chancellor seems to care more about inflationary risks.
Of course, inflation, interest rates, those are two of the factors which I have to think about as I determine what's the appropriate fiscal policy, what's the right level of tax and borrowing and spending.
And it's understandable why he's worried. Inflation is rising rapidly and is expected by the Bank of England to breach 4% over the winter. Higher inflation would make us worse off by eroding living standards, hitting those on low incomes especially hard. Higher interest rates from the Bank of England to rein in inflation could also upset the public finances.
He will be worried that if he fuels too much, if he puts too much money into the economy, it's going to fuel inflation. That will lead to interest rates to spike, and that is going to lead to a big increase in debt servicing costs for our national debt, which is now at historically high levels.
Yet spiralling prices are by no means the only economic threat. Economic growth was very rapid earlier this year, but it slowed markedly in July and August as the supply chain crisis has bitten.
With supply chain issues that are coming, with labour shortages, there is a big risk that there is a knock of confidence in the economy. And if I were the government, I'd be looking at the IMF projections that says that actually by 2024, the UK economy will be lagging behind all other G7 countries. This is the alarm bell, this is the red light, this is the thing they should be focusing on.
This chart shows that government fiscal policy, the red bars, having boosted economic activity considerably during the pandemic, will be a major drag on growth in the coming months and years. This is due to things like the expiry of the universal credit uplift and incoming tax rises like the national insurance hike.
Let's be clear, high inflation and stalling growth are both credible threats. So which is the more serious? The truth is, it's impossible to be confident. So perhaps the key judgment for policymakers is not to choose between the two, but to consider which would be more problematic to deal with if it did materialise.
Some economists argue the Bank of England can handle inflation fairly simply by raising interest rates, but turning fiscal policy back on at short notice next year would be harder.
I understand why he's worried about inflation. Question for him is, what can you do about it versus what you can do about shoring up the growth in this country? I think the government has to keep stimulating the economy. There's a group of economists, including, myself and my organisation, that's imploring the government to pump in about 70 to 90 billion pounds of stimulus investment going into green, going to social infrastructure, so that you can prime the economy, give it a massive boost and counter the risk that we see a slowdown going into next year.
Yet other analysts think fiscal policy can be reactivated next year if required.
In terms of how easy it is to pull a lever, I think turning fiscal policy on is a lot easier than turning fiscal policy off. And you have seen that over the course of the pandemic. The Chancellor seems to be coming back to the House of Commons almost on a monthly basis to pump yet more money into the economy. So I think it is actually quite easy to quickly turn on fiscal policy if that is what the Chancellor decides that the economy needs.
Inflation or deflation? The immense uncertainty of the economic outlook demands a pragmatic and careful approach from the Chancellor. We wait to see whether tomorrow's decisions measure up.
Ben Chu and Ben will be joining us later in the programme. Well, joining me now is Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul Johnson, good evening.
Good evening.
What is it, do you think, that the government wants to project tomorrow? After all, this is a 3-year spending review, which takes us all the way to a general election.
Well, I think they're wanting to project, as you said, the end of austerity, and I think in a very real sense we'll get that. I'd be surprised if any significant part of government spending goes down, and probably most will go up. They'll clearly want to give a sense of stability, considering the considerable instability that we've had over the last couple of years. So we hopefully will get that from spending policy, knowing what we're going to get for the next 3 years. I'll be astonished if we get any further tax increases, because remember, we've had something like £40 billion of tax increases announced this year.
Well, in NI and corporation tax and so forth.
Absolutely. A huge hike in corporation tax announced back in March, a reduction over 4 years in the point at which we start to pay income tax, also announced back in March, and that big hike in national insurance announced in September.
But Paul, you talk about the idea that there is going to be an increase in spending. You sort of say across departments, but who are going to be the biggest losers? Because not everybody is going to be happy. There are much more vulnerable departments than others.
Well, we know, of course, that the health department, that the NHS has already received a huge injection of money over the next couple of years, partly to deal with the pandemic, partly because the NHS is ever growing as we age and as our demands on it grow. Actually, we don't have, I think, enough money for social care. The Prime Minister announced a health and social care levy and a health and social care package last month. Very little money actually in there to fund the social care part of that. The departments at risk on the whole are the ones that have been starved of cash over the last decade: the justice system, the prison system, further education, social care, local government, those sorts of things.
So let's just look at education, because education is the key one for the levelling up agenda. And you had the whole catch-up, we'll remember the whole catch-up czar. The catch-up czar wanted 15 billion, he got 1.3 billion. Presumably, there has to be an indication that education, and you talk about further education as well, is key both to levelling up and to high skills economy. So surely there would have to be a big injection into education.
Yes, I think the long-term, the most worrying long-term consequence of the last 2 years, I think, is the big opening up in the gap of the educational attainment of richer and poorer children. I think a lot of the other things we were worried about through the pandemic in terms of young and old and rich and poor, actually those gaps haven't really opened up as we might have feared. But in terms of what's happened in schools, that really has opened up dramatically. So more funding to help with that catch up of those poorer children, alongside funding to support the further education and vocational skills system, which we've been promised for so long, but has been starved of funding. And when you talk about levelling up, to be clear, poorer secondary schools outside of London have been the hardest hit over the last decade. So there's certainly scope for levelling up in the secondary education system as well.
But you talk about health, and we now know the most recent announcement is $6 billion to clear the backlog. You know, that's on top of extra money that's going in. But actually, that is only going to get us back to pre-pandemic levels, isn't it?
Well, what that $6 billion that was announced a few days ago means is entirely unclear. The really big increases were announced back in September. The idea, the hope is that will help to get us back to pre-pandemic levels of waiting lists and so on over 3 or 4 years. But the real problem here is that so many people didn't attend NHS appointments last year because, essentially because the NHS was closed for business for a lot of people, that those waiting lists could rise really very fast unless we get more resource. And of course, money's, in a sense, easy enough to give to the NHS. Finding the staff, in particular the doctors and the nurses, is a real struggle. The whole world, actually, is looking for qualified medical staff at the moment. So not even a group of people it's easy to import from outside. We can't train them very quickly. So yes, a lot of money has been sent the NHS's way. The issue for the NHS is, can it deliver, and can it find the staff to deliver? And
on the question of cost of living, do you think that Rishi Sunak might be minded to do something, say, for example, on universal credit?
I don't know whether he's going to do anything or not. He must have things in mind. He must have considered, for example, giving additional money to poorer groups over this winter to help pay for fuel bills. We've heard speculation that he might be thinking about reducing the VAT on gas over this period. We know, we don't know, but I think we can assume that for whatever it is, the 11th or 12th year in a row, the duty on petrol won't go up in line with inflation. In other words, will be reduced in real terms. Whether he'll go any further than that through increases in benefits, which would be another reversal of long-term Conservative policy, we'll wait and see.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Well, I'm joined now by Rushanat Ali, who's a Labour MP, who was on the Treasury Select Committee, and by Conservative MP Damien Green, the former de facto Deputy Prime Minister. Good evening to both of you. You heard Paul Johnson there, Damien Green. You are passionate about education. Where is there going to be the evidence tomorrow that education, as we're saying, key to levelling up, is going to be serviced properly?
Well, I would hope that clearly the Chancellor will have left some rabbits in his budget box.
We wanted to put another one out tonight, probably before Lindsay Hoyle was on his case.
Well, so there may be more than one. I mean, there'll clearly be a raft of announcements tomorrow, and as well as tax rates and so on. On education, I'm particularly looking forward to something on skills, vocational education, further education, that sort of area. Not only for all the things Paul Johnson was saying, which I agree with, that it's very important for levelling up, but it's absolutely crucial for productivity. And the high-wage economy that the Prime Minister absolutely rightly wants is sustainable if we increase our productivity.
Yeah, and productivity is key because it's key to killing inflation and everything else, the problems that we have there. One particular area of education in England has been a real red flag, and that has been mental health services and provisions for children coming in to have counselling and so forth. The CAM service has been inundated. I mean, there are real fears there, aren't there, that that service itself needs a lot more money.
Yeah, and indeed, I mean, as you've just been discussing, the health service has got a lot more money. The government has been quite appropriately generous to it, and I think the interface between that and education is extremely important.
Rushanat Ali, Labour presumably welcomes the end of the freeze on public sector pay and the rising of the living and the rise in the living wage. I mean, that's exactly presumably what a Labour government would have done.
Look, the challenge here is that what we've had is over a decade of austerity, and what the government is doing now is taking money from people's pockets, including £1,000 through universal credit, increasing taxes, and then when you add up what they're offering back to our constituents, it's about £250. So they are basically, in effect, making people worse off, because when you look at the combination of the tax burden and what's being taken away, it's not in reality a situation where people are going to be better off. And let's remember that this country has faced a number of shocks. COVID, the economic impact of COVID, but also Brexit. So the long-term impact on our economy requires a really seismic shift in what our government does, and we've just seen that ambition in what they're proposing.
Well, the accusation is, of course, the government has actually been stealing some of Labour's clothes. So what would you be spending more on right now? And not only that, where would you find the money for it?
Well, what we need to do is make sure those who have suffered the most are protected, and that's not happening. We would not scrap universal credit. We would provide VAT cuts for those who are going to face massive challenges with bills, with the cost of living crisis. We would be investing in education, in higher education, in technical skills. We need to make sure we deal with the economic challenges facing us. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to rebuild our economy.
But how would you pay for that? I mean, we have low productivity. That's not going to be fixed in a day. Would you raise taxes?
What we've had is a government that's borrowed a significant amount. They're taxing in the wrong places. I believe that we should ensure those who can bear greatest cost in terms of paying back should do so. What we've got is a government that's basically introduced national insurance that's going to be a burden on workers, on people who have worked incredibly hard in the public services as well in the NHS.
The cost of borrowing is going up. Would you keep borrowing to pay for it? Would that be Labour's position? We just keep borrowing?
Grow our way out of this crisis. And historically, what we've seen after the global financial crisis is this government went for austerity. At the moment, we're getting a bit of a mix and match, not a radical plan for rebuilding our economy, revitalising our economy, investing in innovation and technology. The government talks a lot about being a science superpower and trading with other countries.
Well, let's just bring this back to Damien Green. I mean, Rishan Ali is right, is that people are not, lower paid people are not going to be substantially better off, despite the rise of the living wage to £9.50, despite the idea that there's not longer a freeze on public sector workers.
I mean, the fundamental problem with Russian hours and the Labour analysis is they're still attacking austerity from 2010. Nobody can accuse this government of imposing austerity over the last 2 years. We've gone through a pandemic. We've spent £400 billion of taxpayers' money hugely successfully with things like the furlough scheme, which means that we're coming out of this pandemic with employment at half the level people were predicting. Yes. That's why we can talk about the Chancellor actually making more capital spending.
I suppose when you look at the imposition on local authorities and local authority services and things like cultural services, libraries and so forth, that is very much part of the levelling up agenda too. These are the things that people need to live a full life, and local authorities are struggling.
The two biggest things that I think are needed for successful levelling up are in health and education. They are the big spending departments. We've talked about education. We've talked about health.
We also talked about the fact that the catch-up scheme, instead of 15 billion, the first tranche was 1.3 billion.
Yeah,
and the Tsar resigned because it was such a low amount of money.
Yes, but I mean, one should never measure virtue by the amount of taxpayers' money you spend. You actually have to see what you're getting for it. And that's why I think you should narrowly concentrate at this moment very much on vocational skills, things that this country hasn't done particularly well for about 50 years. I think that will be a genuine revolution if we get that.
Rishan, would you like to see the books balanced by 2024? The fiscal rules, is that a prudent thing to do?
This government has initiated record debt and record taxes, and they've also wasted a huge amount of public money on dodgy contracts during this pandemic. What we need is much more efficient use of public money. We need much more accountability on how money is spent, and we need to ensure we rebuild our public services and we genuinely tackle the inequalities that face this country. We entered into this pandemic with a very unequal society, and this government has learned nothing from what's happened in our country.
Do you think we're going to get something in the cost of living, Damien Green?
We may do. I think I'm hoping we'll get something on universal credit, for example, particularly reducing the taper, reducing the amount that's taken away, because we know we've got 1.2 million vacancies. It is surprisingly easy for people to find jobs. I think people in work should be allowed to keep more of what they earn, and reducing the taper would be a good way of doing that.
And any rabbits in terms of tax?
Maybe. I think it's possible. We've heard talk of changing taxes on alcohol to help what is a fast-growing industry in this country, not just beer, the traditional industry, but wine as well.
And finally, if people don't feel better off by the end of tomorrow, or the possibility of being better off, will the budget then have been a failure?
No, I think because what happens tomorrow, I mean, people won't feel better or worse off by tomorrow. What happens over the next 2 or 3 years to the economy, to jobs, as well as to how well off people feel, that's how you measure a budget.
Thank you both very much. Well, Rishi Sunak is under pressure to top up the £5 billion Building Safety Fund in the spending review tomorrow because of the financial cost of replacing substandard cladding and other fire defects on hundreds of thousands of homes. The plans of housing associations for affordable new homes have been hit by having to divert money to dealing with the building safety crisis. No doubt Michael Gove, the minister who's tasked with resolving the nationwide problem, will have been lobbying the Chancellor hard in advance of tomorrow. But Newsnight has learned that there is a fundamental problem that few had foreseen. Homeowners need certain documents, including the building plans, in order to seek redress. But for some reason, in a number of cases, these documents are proving hard to find. Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall.
For the leaseholders of Transport House in Salford, a building replete with fire safety problems and whose residents are facing bills of £100,000 apiece, every week seems to bring worse news.
This apartment at the moment is not worth the paper that this literature's printed on.
This year, Newsnight has followed their story. One hope they had was that they might be able to use the original drawings of the building and then compare it to what was actually built. If the building deviated from those plans, it's possible they might have been in a stronger position to sue. After months, the local authority has reported back.
We've now obtained some documents, but the bundle that would have been available to us from the local authority doesn't contain everything that would support what we need. So there are some documents available, but not everything.
And what sort of documents weren't there that you had hoped might be there?
We were hoping that the main specifications of the building alongside the plans would be available to us, and that would then tell us what is actually behind the cavity walls, what is behind the cladding, instead of us having to go through further investigation.
Unfortunately, because more than 15 years have elapsed, Salford Council have disposed of some of the documentation. Without the full suite of documents, any potential litigation is even harder. And because this building is under 18 metres and the main problem isn't cladding, it isn't eligible for government support.
If those documents were to hand and they'd been stored and archived correctly the way that it should have been, the majority of the information that they're digging behind the walls to find it would have been there on paper, and they'd have known it, and it would have been there as evidence, and the work that they're doing in terms of investigation and probably in terms of remedial work may not be as intensive, may not be as extensive, and are expensive.
No, I've got every sympathy for that.
You might think the council would hold these documents in perpetuity. Not so.
Maybe actually it might be a good idea just to keep some of these documents for these newer buildings.
Of course, we've kept those documents and we've handed over those documents.
No, but I mean the full suite of documents.
Yeah, if we kept every full suite relating to every single building control case, it'd be quite difficult to do so, I think. What I think we've done is we've cooperated with the residents to the extent of handing over all the documentation that we've been able to locate.
It's taken a long time.
Yeah, well, I can't comment on how long it's taken. What I can tell you is that we've done that because it took us a while to track down what documentation we had.
And what of the freeholder and developer? The leaseholders had told us that they'd been told that their plans had been lost. Indeed, in response to the local MP, Irwell Valley, the freeholder, told her that they did not have the original contract drawings and documents. But tonight, Irwell Valley told us that they did have drawings and documents, but when we asked why they haven't provided them to the leaseholders, they didn't answer the question. Lovell, the developer, told us that they too have some documents after all, saying, "We have searched our records and were able to locate a limited number of design details which we have shared. Records will naturally be incomplete due to the age of this development."
Again, it isn't clear, given the length of time that the leaseholders at Transport House have been asking for these documents, why they haven't been provided before now, nor whether they'll be any clearer or more detailed than those of the local authorities. But this isn't a rare occurrence. There are lots of examples of documents mysteriously going missing or simply not being provided when asked for, making the legal process that much harder. Newsnight has spoken to dozens of people in such a position or worse, and Steph is one of them.
The local council, the freeholder, the developer, no luck, minimal communication as well, which has been very frustrating. The developer has given us absolutely no explanation, real lack of communication. There is no reason that they can come up with as to why these documents aren't available, why they've been lost. So we don't know, essentially, if our building is about to go up in flames.
These documents aren't exactly old or lost to time, but it's the same old system of a poor regulatory regime, poor record keeping, sometimes incompetence, or potentially worse.
There have been a lot of floods, it would appear, or office moves or archiving units that have been broken into. There's often lots of excuses as to why information that really should be available or capable of being found can't be found for whatever reason. That information is fundamentally important. We need to know why these buildings were built, how they were designed, what the systems are that keep people safe, and are those systems being maintained in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions.
The surfeit of cases of missing documents is one of the reasons one of the government's preferred solutions to all this litigation is simply off the table for most. It makes the anticipation of hundreds of thousands of people to see what the Chancellor does tomorrow all the sharper.
Lewis Goodall. Well, in a statement, Irwell Valley's Homes Chief Executive said, as the building is over 15 years old, the original building documents were archived. At the time of writing to Rebecca Long Bailey in October last year, we'd not retrieved all of the documents she'd asked from our archives. We have since carried out further document searches and are currently taking legal advice in relation to potential liabilities. We are therefore unable to comment further at this time. They added, as a not-for-profit housing association, we're also continuing to push for more support for leaseholders affected. Their safety remains our #1 priority, and we've funded interim safety measures while we work with all parties to find a way forward. Earlier this month, violent clashes in Beirut touched off fears of renewed civil strife in Lebanon. The country has been mired in crisis of late, political, economic, COVID, and on top of that, the devastating port blast of 15 months ago. As if that's not bad enough, a brain drain of the education professionals has been gathering pace. Leaving carries shame, so there's no reliable statistics about that flight. In the second of our 2 films from Lebanon, Mark Urban reports now from Beirut.
Each day, Joe Tatul does the rounds, delivering meals to those who are faltering amid the punishing realities of life in Lebanon. This woman's husband lost his job after the Beirut port blast, and now they live hand to mouth.
Her husband works in a firm on a salary of $1,200,000. That used to be worth about $800, but today amounts to just $50 or $60. So she can't afford to rent an apartment. She just pays for the utilities. The electricity is about $600,000 a month, and that leaves her $600,000 to live on. She has a daughter of 5 who she sent to her sister's place, and she manages her place for the moment.
We head across to another family, but a similar story. Professional people now destitute because of disaster and economic crisis. Here, a woman who can't afford to rent anymore has moved back in with her mother. Many salaries have been crushed by rampant inflation. Originally established to help the elderly, this charity delivers food and medicine, and the numbers needing help have soared in the past 2 years.
Actually,
we had about 100 people, and today we're close to 600 per day.
But of course, some people leave, some stay. 1,500 per day? Yes, but financially we have a limit. That wouldn't allow us to go on for more than 3 months like that.
On the Corniche, Syrian refugee children sell flowers, but there are few takers. In so many ways, it feels like people are just about getting by. The UN says 74% of Lebanon's population is now living in poverty. Those businesses that steam on, like Tusk Coffee, know that the banks only allow small daily withdrawals and charge foreign currencies at old rates, which due to rampant inflation are punitive, as any foreign credit card holder soon finds out.
So once you get into the subject of money, you get into a real looking glass world here. These 5 coffees, if you change them at the official rate, if you put your credit card down, for example, you'd be charged $67, over £50 for 5 coffees. But if you've changed your money on the black market, it'll cost you about $1 a coffee, less than £1 a time. And it's those kind of differences between what you can get for your money officially and what you can get on the black market that create opportunities for some people, but keep many others trapped, unable to access their money.
Many affluent neighbourhoods are emptying out. Lina Nakuz lives in Ashrafia.
So tell me about the neighbours. They have mostly gone, is that right?
Most of them are gone. For instance, if you go to this building here, you know, the rooftop, used to be a lot of people. One neighbor here and one neighbor here. They left. In this building also, you can see, they didn't even repair the glass.
Having lost her husband 5 years ago and her job as an architect just before COVID, Lina is losing the battle to stay.
Since the blast, everything worsened. Every day is worse than the day before. I was told my apartment was gone, this one. After I lost my job, I couldn't find a new job. Money is still stuck in the bank. So everything is pushing us out. And people that don't go out, that means they don't have the possibility.
It was supporting her daughter Maria's pre-medical studies that kept Lina here. But now Maria is telling her mother to leave Beirut.
It's a quite tough decision because I wanted to stay here, to stay with my family, to feel like I'm in my home. It's my home here. I don't want to leave. I want to study here, surrounded by my family. Some of my friends, but the rest of my friends are all now abroad. They are all outside of Lebanon.
So in order to finance her daughter's studies, Lina is looking for care work in France.
Look, you've come to a difficult decision now.
Very difficult, because we never been, my daughter and I, we have only each other. In 2 words, we only have each other.
What does it look like from now? Do you have a date in mind? Do you have a flight booked? Do you have a job that you're going to try and get?
I don't have a job. I have a flight booked, 8th of November.
The cataclysmic port explosion of August 2020 was a body blow to a country already marred in crisis. There's been a determination, though, to rebuild and to hang on despite the vicissitudes of fate. A luxury development near the port offered retail units rent-free for a year to traders and artists. Rana Salman makes art and is a branding consultant. She's determined to stay and knows that leaving carries shame.
My God, that word is, yeah, it kind of hurts. But of course, like any business, I've opened and closed business quite a few times in Beirut, and it's you somewhere you kind of start doubting yourself and you feel like you're a failure. But look at it, I'm up again on my feet, and in every situation that's negative, you have to, you know, I always believe in the British, you know, the show must go on. So the show must go on. What am I supposed to do? Lock up and go back to my flat?
Rana's rent holiday will be over soon, and she intends to sell her services to overseas businesses. But so many of her friends and fellow artists, her milieu, can't do that.
Absolutely, the milieu has shrunk, I have to admit. I live a very simple, but yeah, I mean, the Beirut still celebrates, people go out and hang out, but yes, the milieu has shrunk, I have to admit. But I mean, I just have myself, my product, I live probably in my own bubble, but I've got to constantly look abroad. I'm not really interacting with too many people here, unfortunately, because a lot of them have left.
This is a place where connections are made and abandoned as the circumstances demand. In this case, cables from generators carry private electricity supplies for many because the national grid is so unreliable. And when a local generator operator goes bust, someone else steps in, and the new wires go up. There are so many different power struggles going on here now that some fear open conflict could soon be added to the country's list of woes.
I cannot imagine what also we have like a problem is no health, no food, no gas, no electricity, no hope. No hope because you know what happened in Ain al-Rumani. I can feel it. I'm used to war. I can feel it. It's war.
The reality of Beirut's present mess shows itself at nightfall.
Wandering around here at night is really quite eerie. There's no street lighting, of course, because of the power situation, but very few of the flats are occupied. It's a wealthy part of the city, and one has to presume that the professionals and other well-off people who live here have gone. Now, there's shame involved in doing that, and there's no statistics. The government probably wouldn't want to share them, even if they had them. But you really get the feeling, to a considerable extent, of a society that's gone into hibernation.
So Beirutis while away the nights and wonder about their own staying power, whether to live more cheaply in the countryside or seek work abroad. But the resilience of this city remains remarkable.
Mark Urban in Beirut. Well, I'm joined by our economics editor one more time, Ben Chu, who's going to talk to us about the front pages. But first, what about the fiscal rules then? What are we actually going to hear tomorrow?
Well, we've had some pretty strong hints that the fiscal rules are going to be quite similar to the ones we had 10 years ago with George Osborne. So that's current budget balance at some point, and then debt falling as a share of GDP. So the key is, when is he going to try and hit them? Because that will determine how much space he has for spending on other things and how much leeway he has.
And we heard Damien Green there talk about what he was hoping for was a taper on universal credit, because he's disadvantaging families and work.
Yeah, so obviously the contentious decision to remove the universal credit uplift has put a big squeeze on families. This is a sense of probably going to be something that will help defray some of that cost. It won't remove that cost, but it will help perhaps make it a bit less severe on, 6 million families who've been badly affected by it.
And one other thing, that there's going to be some kind of, not a squib, but a pop on English wine, very post-Brexit tax issue there.
Yes, this has been briefed quite a lot. I mean, alcohol taxes are a real mess. A lot of chancellors over the years have fiddled around with them to favour what their favourite tipple is. This is a chance to rationalise it, one hopes, as well as perhaps being a propaganda thing for saying Brexit enables us to do this, which we couldn't before.
And climate change. The Times front page, let's say fast growth gives Sunak chance to splash cash.
Yeah,
chance.
So absolutely, Kirsty. Chance is the key thing in there. If he gets growth upgrades, he will have more money to play with, and he can spend more on public services. But will he choose to do that? We don't know that. That's going to be one of the, as we were mentioning yesterday on Newsnight, the key thing to keep an eye out for.
And also on the front page, the news there that we heard tonight, the Queen has cancelled her trip to the climate conference, but will be recording a message for world leaders from Windsor. Now, Yorkshire Post. Give us cash for skills revolution. Again, discussion tonight. Rishanala Ali was talking about that again tonight. We need the skills revolution to up our productivity and therefore keep inflation at bay.
Absolutely, but also this is about levelling up. The Yorkshire Post, they want that money, they want that commitment to underpin this slogan which this government has about levelling up. They say you've got to deliver tomorrow to Mr Sunak and the government.
And of course it is the chance to show the levelling up agenda is more than just words tomorrow in the budget.
Absolutely, a really key point.
And then, yes, also to strike a bullish note on the budget. On the Guardian front page there were thundering wake-up call. World faces 2.7% Celsius temperature rises, says UN. Again, part of the budget.
Yeah, very important, because the budget has and the spending review have to put money behind the net zero agenda and a clear sense of that fiscally they are supporting that, because if they don't, they're going into COP saying, do as I say, not as I do to other world governments.
And that's actually going to be quite a tough ask as well, though. So thanks very much indeed, Ben. That's all from us tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. From all of us here, goodbye.